And Inayat, floor is yours,
Yeah.
man. Please
All
take it
right.
away.
Thanks, Navid. Thank you, Navid. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Happy Friday and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. So today I'll be mainly covering Microsoft Purview, some of this stuff which I have already covered in my past sessions as well. So you could take a look at the intro stuff on Microsoft Purview, but in this case, I'm going to mainly focusing on creating the custom store procedure and especially the lineage part using the PyApacheAtlas. And I'm going to briefly walk you through on where this custom stuff fits and what you could do out of the box as well. But on top of that, how I have infused this with the Azure OpenAI as well. So give you some background on that one as well. But before diving into that, let's briefly cover the Microsoft Purview in case folks are new. And then we can mostly dive into the hands-on right after. So I'm going to quickly take probably maybe a 5 minutes or so, quickly walk you through the key elements and all this kind of stuff, and then we can quick start on the hands-on and demo part. All right. So with that, here's the agenda high level, which I just briefly cover, and let's move on. So as most of you may have already know what Microsoft Purview is, it's just really a unified data governance tool that's been available, and the whole purpose of that is to bring your the overall assets that you have from a data perspective or data state that you have across your enterprises and have it available in single place. So all the metadata information or the data that customers are or users are looking for, they are readily available for people to search on it. And it also gives you the governance framework, right, where data is owned by normally business folks, and you can define who the business owners are and give the control to business owners where they could manage the assets on behalf of their users or their particular organization. And eventually this information can then be used to drive certain policies, and you can share certain data and all this kind of stuff. So basically the whole idea is on the left side, you have all your sources. It could be on-prem or it could be cloud sources. You bring and scan your data sources. It brings the data into Purview, all the metadata and all the stuff. You could catalog that. You could classify those based on the classification rule. You can define your custom classification. There are out-of-the-box classifications there. So there are lots of features out there. There are business glossary there, which you could then attach it to each metadata at a table level, attribute level. You can define owners and all this kind of stuff, right? And then so basically it's a whole data governance tool, and then you can define the policy against your sources. There are numerous sources which are supported, which you could govern your policy directly from Purview. And then there's a workflow aspects of it as well, right? So if somebody requests the access for certain source, you could potentially have a data policy defined there, and your data owner can grant directly access from here from a Purview as well. So yeah, so lots of good features available in here, and then eventually this data can be leveraged by various different tools to scan your sources or drive some workflows and all this kind of stuff, right, on top of that. So again, getting the data in, and then eventually you can integrate with the other target sources. So that's a very high level view of what Purview is about. For detailed videos, you can take a look into my previous sessions. But basically, to get the Purview going, you need to create an account or provision the Purview account, just like any other services you need to provision. Pretty straightforward setup. Just provide a name and a resource where you need to provision, set up the networking and stuff like that, and then yeah, it's just available there. There are a few things it depends on, like event hubs. It also use some of this Kafka, some of this Atlas tools and all those things behind the scene, which is your API, which is what drives some of this underlying management of the Purview itself. So let's move on. So one of the key thing here is there are various different features I already mentioned, right? So you could do the auto scanning and all this kind of stuff against your different sources. But the key goal here for this particular topic here is how to leverage this Apache Atlas OpenAI API, right? And this is an underlying core API which drives some of this interaction that you see it from the user perspective or UI perspective. It's all driven behind the scene through some of these APIs, right? So some of these APIs are very it's very deeper and very thorough, and you could do lots of stuff through this, right? So there are many things you can do from UI, but there are things which you some of the features which are not currently enabled, right? Which you may want to drive, or some stuff that you may not need to automate or have a control over on it, how you really drive some of these processes. And one of this lineage, which I'm going to be covering here, is the if you have an on-prem SQL, and right now this is something in the roadmap that where the lineage will going to be provided down the road, but right now that lineage is not available, right? So one of the customer has a significant footprint on-prem, and they wanted to do the lineage on their on-prem store procedures and all those kind of stuff. So that was a gap there. And then what I looked at it was what are the different ways to really get this going, right? And I'm gonna give you some reference, and there are good articles and good repository already out there, worked on by one of my colleague, Will Johnson, and I'll share the link with you. He has done a tremendous job in this whole different ways to really bring your data in, and he has the templates and everything in place, right? So I'm going to drop a link to that as well. Take a look into that as well. So again, first thing is you define your classification, and then you define how you want to classify or group certain sets of your data sources. And then basically, once you have this in place, then you can perform an auto scan, right? So normally there are lots of the sources are already available, which you can do auto scan and also do a lineage on top of it, right? It's available, but apparently the on-prem SQL is something the lineage is not available, as I mentioned. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So here's the very high-level steps, which I covered in my past video as well. The first step is you need to register and scan your data source, and bring your the tables or whatever that asset that you have from those sources. Bring that into your into the Purview, right? So this is a way you really do that. You establish your connection to the sources, and then define your scan, and then basically you can define different scan rules and all those kinds of stuff, how to do the classification if you have custom classification rules. So all these things really helps you bring the data and auto classify some of the stuff. So I'm not going to dive too much into that, but the main part is the lineage one, right? So what Lineage does is there are out-of-the-box lineages are available. For example, there's a lineage for ADF, Azure Data Factory. So if you are running some ADF jobs, that the lineage of sources and targets are being pushed into the Purview, and then you could see the lineage, something like this, right? Where maybe in the middle you have an ADF data copy job, and then what are the sources that you have which are providing the input to that, and then what are the target that it's feeding, right? So you could see that kind of a lineage, and this is in out-of-the-box functionality. And I will briefly show how this is really configured and it's worked. But then again, that's not really the whole purpose for this session. Is really how to really drive this, where you cannot do this kind of an automated feature which is available through the UI, right? So moving on, just quickly dive into the Atlas. So this is what underneath that there's a documentation out there on Microsoft side. So there's a REST API underneath. It's an Apache Atlas. It has been really the foundational element there using the Apache Atlas, and there are some things which has been done on top of that, which is somewhat different than what the core or base Apache Atlas API offers, right? So there are a few things that you could do with this, right, with the REST API. And the key things are you could define the types, and what the types is, it helps you to a way to really provide some structure and guidance and relationships between sets of objects, right? At the end, everything is an object, and how you really define or classify that object. For example, you may have a SQL Server related objects, you may have a other source, Oracle, or it may be a Cosmos DB, right? So those are different types of asset that you have, but then again, how those within those assets, how things interrelate. For example, if you have a SQL Server, then you have a schema, you have your tables, you have your columns. So what kind of a relationship are there between those? Those are all defined and configured through types, right? So there are out-of-the-box types already available, but you can define your own custom types if you need to. If, let's say, if some sources which are not available in this Purview supports, then you can create your own custom type, right? And then define the relationship between those types, and then bring the data and lineage and all this kind of stuff through this API from there on. The other key one is the entity. This helps you to create a new entity, update the entity, and all this kind of a basic operation you can perform on it. And the glossaries, like you can also, again, to define your custom glossary and manage those glossaries through this. The relationship is, again, how you define the relationship between your entities. So you can also define those. And then the key one is the lineage one here, which we're going to be talking about, is how a set of a process, right, which is your, that's, for example, your store procedure, right? It is defined as a process, but then what that particular process input that it takes and what is the output it produces, right? So that's where the lineage comes into the play. So it takes the input, it takes the process, and it takes the sets of output that it needs to link together. So that's what we're gonna quickly take a look into that. So here is again what I briefly mentioned. So there is a Python version of that, and which is what we're going to be taking a look into that, and which is a PyAtlas version of it. So you can also play with the base REST API, or you can use a Python SDK if you are a Python-based customer, and then that's what you prefer. And again, these are the sets of things which I briefly mentioned to you about. You could do that, and there are many more things you can do right on top of this. But the key thing is, again, we're going to be more focusing on the lineage part. So let's move on. So first thing is the type def, which I mentioned, right? So this is a very important thing because everything is driven through the type def. This is kind of your contract, you may think of, right, from a web service perspective, which defines a key relationship between your objects. And I'm going to show you how that looks at a very high level, and then we'll just jump into that. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So let me now start to jump into the if you can please mute, that would be great if you don't have any question. All right, so the first thing is I'm going to just quickly show you the REST API version, and then before jumping into the Python version of it. And this is really the REST API, and you could see the references there. But what it really takes is the first step is you need to create a application registration, because through that application registration, you are able to access your REST endpoint, just like any other services, right? And basically, once you create that app registration, the identity of that is normally you assign it to your Purview. So now at the end, with the client secret that you normally create the app registration, you start to access the backend API through this access token that you are configuring in here through app registration. So the first step really is before you jump into that is you just go and create and register your app registration. I'm not going to dive into that. I already created this. You create your certificate and secrets, whatever that the secrets that you produce. Using that app registration ID and secret, it will going to give you the underlying. Once it registers it, you need to go into your Purview, and basically you assign this permission. You need to make sure that at the collection level, if you go into the collection here, and if you go in the role assignment, make sure that particular service principal that has been associated to that app registration that you created, you assign a curator role here, right? And that's what it helps you to communicate to the Purview resources through this service principal, which you already configured. So that's the first step needs to be in place. Once that is in place, then basically you are able to use that the various different REST endpoints, and then using that client ID and secret that you created as a service principal, pass that in. It gives you the token back, and then using that token is what you use to communicate, right? So if I run these things, it gives you basically the token, right? And here's the token. And what I did here is now if I need to get any communication or any subsequent call I need to make, I can use that, and I pass that token here, and then I paste it in here, and then I make that call, right? You need to make sure that the basic setup is in place. But in this case, I'm calling a specific API to get the type defs, and it gives you the type def information. And this is the contract I was mentioning about, right? How the relationship between objects are defined. And in this case, there are various different stuff, like there is a Cosmos related, there's other SQL and other databases are there. And then the one that we are going to be configuring is Azure SQL table. In this case, that's what we are planning to use. So I'm not going to jump too much into that. Let's jump to the code since we only have about a very short amount of time. So let's go into the main part, which is your this one, right? So what I have here is so the issue that I am trying to deal with is a automated way to really go and scan your database by defining the database connection. It goes and looks into all the stored procedures that you have it in your database, and it scans through all the stored procedure. It extracts the stored procedure text, which is what the stored procedure is about. And then what I'm doing here is, instead of like manually defining some kind of a loader where you define the source and target and what the process looks like and all this underlying backend stuff, what I did was I used OpenAI, right, in this case, to avoid that a manual way to really go and identify, here's my stored procedure, but then in the stored procedure, the customer says, well, I have thousands of stored procedure. I don't have anybody who can really go and dive into the stored procedure to understand what is the source, what is the target, and all those kinds of stuff. How can we automate this, right? And this is where I infuse this with the OpenAI. And what I'm doing here is I'm looping through the stored procedure, all the stored procedures. I'm passing the stored procedure to OpenAI and asking the OpenAI with the right instructions to extract the source and target from that stored procedure in a defined way, in a defined pattern. And then once it gives me the source and target information, I loop through those information, and then using the API that I just talked about to create the lineage in the Purview. So that's how I'm really approaching this. So let's quickly walk through how I'm doing it. So first thing, I'm defining some of this basic connectivity like OpenAI connection. I'm not going to dive too much into OpenAI at the moment. That's maybe a different topic. But here is the service principle I was talked about, right? The registration, app registration you did, you need to have that in place. And with that, it's going to give you the token back, and then you use that token to communicate, right, at the end. I also have a SQL Server configuration, which I defined, which is an Azure SQL Server I have. Show you right here. So this is what I have, and then I have two stored procedures there, which I'm going to show you how that works. But this is what I'm scanning, this two stored procedure within this database. That's my goal. I mean, you could have hundreds or thousands, how many stored procedure doesn't matter. So once that is in place, here is what a basic thing I'm doing right here is. This is one way to really create an entity. I'm not going to be creating the entity. The assumption here is you have already performed the scan against those databases, right? So the tables and all those information are already there. The goal here is to create the lineage between those tables and whatever the stored procedures you already have it in place. So assumption is that your tables already exist in the Purview. You already have performed the scan. If not, you could potentially do and create your entity here as well. And what it takes is you can create a reference of Atlas entity, and then you can define the name of the table. What is the type of the table? This again is very important because this comes from the type defs, right? So this is a specific type that you are creating because your table, you are scanning the Azure SQL, and then you are providing a qualifier name. And this is where it defines the relationship between it forms the qualifier name through what is the schema, what is a table, what is a database, and what is a table, right? So this is the format that it expects you, because this is how it's defined in the contract. So you have to follow this particular format in order to produce that. And then you can just arbitrarily define any GUID. And then once you have this particular setup, then you can call this client.upload entities. You can create a multiple entities if you want. In this case, if I have multiple, you can do multiple one, or you can do a single. So this creates sets of entities in your Purview based on this configuration. So that's the first part. The second part is now I'm connecting to SQL Server, as I mentioned. So I'm already using PyODBC to connect to the Azure SQL. I am now using the query specific query, which will gonna give me a list of all the stored procedures which are in that database, right? So that's what I'm using this system query, and it gives me the list of all the stored procedures. So if I execute this one, what it gives me is it fetches the stored procedure name, it fetches the stored procedure text, and that's all I need right now, right? So if I execute this one, this is what it gives me, right, at the end. So it gives me the text of the stored procedure, and I'm taking this text and passing that to OpenAI. So how am I calling that? Let's take a look into that. And so in order to create the lineage, I need a set of inputs. That's why I create the list of inputs. And here's a list of outputs I created, right? What is expects. And here's the qualifier name. I hard-coded this one in here because I already know that, but you could dynamically create based on your stored procedures. And here is the type def, because I already know that this is Azure SQL table. You can also, again, dynamically just populate this if you need it. And in this case, I'm using the process type because this is a stored procedure is a process, and here's the sets of inputs and sets of outputs, right? And then I'm going to eventually tie this back. I'm using the DaVinci model for OpenAI in order to pass the information. Here's very specific instruction I'm passing right now, right, to OpenAI. And if you take a look into the OpenAI right here, okay, so yeah, so here is the here is the OpenAI, which I'm using text DaVinci, and here's the instruction I'm really formulating, right? So use the below stored procedure to generate the source and target table name processed by stored procedure. Do not include the temp table. I don't want temp table. I want all the real tables, right? The output should be in this format, right? Which I'm providing the source table name, give me the list of all source table names, then the target table name, and then give me a list of all target, right? So I'm asking you to do a very specific formatting that I'm expecting it to produce, right? Do not provide a solution or expression or any other thing, right? And then I'm now passing this stored procedure. This is dynamically I'm passing that stored procedure text, and then the expectation is when I run this, this is what it gave me, right? It gave me the source table name. It gave me whatever the source it's feeding into the stored procedure, and it's also giving me the output it's producing, right? In this case, it's feeding into the same one. So this is what it's really the OpenAI gives me. Azure OpenAI gives me as an output, right? So that's what I am doing it in here. Let me go back here quickly. Right, so that's really the instruction here, and this is stored procedure text I'm dynamically populating in here, right? And then I'm calling an OpenAI completion, right, API, and then basically with some tokens and all those things, it gives me that list, what I showed you, right? So this is what the data list it gives me, which has the source table name as in the root, and then also target, right? And then it carries a child nodes in there, which are the list of source table names and then the list of target table names. And then I'm looping this through and then formulating this Atlas entity, which I just showed to you right here on the top, how you create this Atlas entity, right? So I'm producing the inputs and outputs. And then before I produce that, I'm also verifying that if this input already exists or not. If it doesn't exist, so I'm using one of this another API call, which is a get entity, and I'm passing that table name which the OpenAI gave me, just to make sure this table already exists or not. If it doesn't exist, I'm not creating it. You can end up creating the new table and all this kind of stuff. I didn't do that, right? But you can do that, definitely. So I looped through, I formulate all the sources, all the input entries, which I put and plug that into this input list. And then I formulated another one, which I plugged into the output list. Once I have that list here, I then made a call here. I just want to make sure that the input and outputs are, one of the inputs or outputs are available. If none of them are available, there's no point of creating the lineage, right? I mean, you can create a process, but if there's no input or output, it doesn't make sense, right? So that's what I'm making a check here. And then I'm passing and calling this Atlas process, which is what your particular process, which sits in the middle of that, the lineage, which is in your case is your stored procedure. And then I have dynamically populated the stored procedure name as I was looping through, and then passed its inputs, which I collected, which OpenAI gave me, and formulated this Atlas entity out of it. And the same thing I did for outputs. And then I made a call here, and then I called this upload entities of Atlas, and then it created the lineage in this case, right? So that's how I really approached it. And if you execute this thing, it loops through all the stored procedure, it extracts, it makes a call to OpenAI, it extracts the inputs entities and output entities and create this whole lineage. And once you execute this one, and if you go back into the Purview, and you should be able to see, for example, let's make sure that I have the right, so this one will error log, okay. So if you search for error log, so when I executed that one, this is what it produced right here, right? It produced this as a process is your SQL, that their stored procedure name, and then it's taking the same input and also producing the same output. So that's why you see the input is coming in, and then output is also coming to the same stored procedure. Basically, you are updating, you are feeding in the log, and then you are getting update, or you're updating the same table in this case. But I have seen, I ran the same thing for a very complex scenario for one of the customer. It has produced very complex process or lineage for multiple sources and multiple targets, right? So this is how I have been approached this, infused with OpenAI using the AI capabilities and dynamically generating this whole lineage. This is a very powerful tool. You could basically think of unlimited scenarios in this case. Basically, you can write your custom tools and stuff, which you can basically connect to any sources, and then you can really produce your lineage out of this. So with that, I'll just, we have 1 minute, and I'll just open up for questions if you guys have.
Folks, please open up your mic if you have any questions.
Hey, Nat, Shashi, a quick question. Is this the USP logger is the name of the stored procedure?
That is the name of the stored procedure, yes.
Thank you.
So if you go here, right here.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Right.
Might be a little bit off topic. When you create that OpenAI, we can leverage the same scenario for reverse engineering when I'm doing migrations to compare source and targets in a similar fashion.
You can, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to how you pass the instruction. There is a significant a codex model which used to be, but now everything is available as part of 3.5 and 4.0. Yes, you can do all these different kind of scenarios in there.
All right, thank you. Is that your source code is on GitHub open sourced, or is it still your
it is there. So here is the link to Will Johnson's site. He may have already, or he will be publishing there. Very great resources available on Will's site around this whole Python Atlas API. He has already some kind of a loader there, so he will probably be loading up here as well. I already shared with him, so most likely he'll be sharing on his repository.
Yeah, I've seen this from Will, but I'm talking specific to your OpenAI integration pieces. That's going to come.
He's going to be loading it in here in the same place on the same Git repository.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions, folks? Okay, thank you for joining. Let me stop the recording.